Hi, everyone. Welcome. Happy Thursday. Hope you're all having a great start to your day so far. We're just going to give a couple minutes for others to trickle in, and we'll get started very shortly. All right. I think we'll go ahead and get started now. As people trickle in, we'll certainly let them in. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Gabrielle, and I'm a program manager here at the Learning Bar. Welcome to our fourth session of the Building Leaders and Readers Literacy webinar series. We're excited to have you join us today for a deeper exploration of the Confident Learner's three-phase model, designed to simplify and strengthen literacy instruction. Building on our previous show and tell session, this webinar will dive deeper into each phase, offering educators a practical, systematic approach to guide and monitor student learning. Grounded in the Learning Bar's expert research and proven educational strategies, our model supports educators every step of the way. All attendees will receive free access to our systematic reading instruction course and its complimentary lesson package, giving you immediate tools to bring this impactful approach into your classroom. I wanted to let you know as well that this webinar is being recorded, and a member of our team will ensure that everyone receives the recording in an email afterwards. Before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional ancestral territory of the First Nations people in our respective locations on which we are learning, working, and gathering today. We pay our respects to the members, past and present, with honor and gratitude as they have stewarded the land throughout the generations. I am confident that we will continue to work together in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. Thank you. So let's move on to meet our presenters of today's session. I'm happy to introduce them both. I have the privilege of working with them quite frequently myself. So I'll start with introducing Simon Ketcheson. He is our Confident Learners Product Director. Simon leads the design and delivery of literacy programs focused on improving educational outcomes for students across diverse communities. Simon brings over a decade of expertise in educational product management, client success, and implementation, with a proven track record in helping organizations meet and exceed their goals. We're also joined today by Erica Sutherland, a learning consultant in the Confident Learners program here at the Learning Bar. Erica taught with the Halifax Regional Center for Education for 31 years as an elementary classroom teacher, literacy coach, literacy consultant, and a reading and writing interventionist. She believes that a strong early start to literacy learning creates a solid foundation for all future learning and social emotional well-being. Simon, I'll hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gabby. Thanks for the introduction. Really excited to share more about the theory and details behind Confident Learners today. We, of course, did a show and tell last week, which was looking a little bit more at the nuts and bolts and kind of the actual pieces of the program. But today we're going to dive into some of the theory and connect that with practice. So a little bit about us to begin. We are located as a company here in Fredericton, New Brunswick, but our team is spread out across the country. But Dr. Willems founded the Learning Bar 20 years ago, actually this year, after having worked as a professor and in social development for 40 plus years. So Dr. Willems, or Doug, has brought together a team of educators, researchers, literacy experts, etc., who all share the same vision, right? Giving all children the opportunity to thrive. So that means we want to give you the tools that you need to support students and give them the skills they need to learn, starting with literacy. So we have a range of offerings in this area, from professional learning to assessment and intervention. They're all designed to meet your needs as Canadian educators, which are in constant evolution. So we're looking, as I said today, at the theory side of Confident Learners, so the two bottom pieces here, building on that previous webinar. Just to give a quick overview of the different components of Confident Learners, really what Confident Learners is a multi-year approach integrating principal and teacher and support staff professional learning with a systematic research-based literacy program. So the top two elements here are the support from our team with respect to leadership development and instructional support. And then the bottom pieces are the intervention, assessment, and professional development or professional learning courses. So those were spoken about in the show and tell. If you want to learn a little bit more about exactly what each of those looks like, you can view that or find the recording. But today I'll talk about the structure of the scope and sequence, or the underlying elements of confident learners. That's the what. I mean, the why is also equally important, right? So when we look at the recent PISA results, right, the Program for International Student Achievement, we see that scores are declining, and we can see from Canada here that actually the percentage of students at age 15 with reading scores below level 3 has increased from about a quarter to almost 40% from 2000 to 2022, the most recent cycle. In other words, 40% of students at age 15 are reading at roughly grade 4 level or below, right? Now that's not a direct correlation, but it's close to that level. So that data is available Canada-wide, of course, internationally, but also by province as well. So that's one trend. The other challenge, and certainly as classroom teachers, I know this is your daily reality. There's a huge range in skills as students enter the school system, right? And that range tends to persist as they advance through the grades. So we talk about roughly a 4-year or more range in some of the foundational skills as students enter school, and that certainly hasn't been aided by recent things such as the pandemic. What does that mean in practice? In most schools, if we look at the left-hand side here, most children's age and skill level tend to match up a little bit more, right? So you can see that they've got a skill level of about maybe 5 or 6 or 5, and they're around age 5. But in low socioeconomic status schools, it's actually skewed in the opposite direction, and more children have a skill level below what we might expect at their age, right? And what that means for the classroom is that in those lower SES contexts, we can't take a tier 3 pullout approach, right? There's too many children that have those higher needs, not enough resources, or even if that's even an option, right? So that structure may work in many circumstances, but it definitely doesn't in others. And that brings us to confident learners, right? So when children don't learn to read efficiently in primary years, it's almost always because they haven't learned how to decode words. What confident learners brings to the table is a systematic approach with a focus on whole class instruction, right? So let's dig into that. Let's look at the scope and sequence in great detail here. So by explicit, right, we mean that we have a clear and detailed scope with the skills, topics, and concepts being taught. And by ordered, it's the sequence, right? We have a well-defined sequence in which the skills must be taught. So confident learners scope and sequences was inspired in part by this recent paper by Castles, Rassel, and Nation called Ending the Reading Wars. Confident Learners has existed for actually almost 10 years, but we've made significant revisions to the program beginning about 3 years ago, right at around just before the pandemic, to bring it into line with this 3-phase structure. So in phase 1, we're primarily looking at coding skills. In phase 2, we start to look at the structure of language, orthography, morphology. We start to read more and more passages. And then in phase 3, we're primarily concerned with comprehension, right? Using projects and integrating other subject matter content to aid in students' comprehension. So we're going to take a look at each of these in great detail. Well, I should say with as much detail as is possible within 1 hour. But the course systematic reading instruction is going to provide you with significantly more detail and examples for implementation and practice than what we can cover today in 1 hour. So the 3-phase model is generally aligned to the simple view of reading, right? Where we have comprehension depending on these two components, right? Decoding and linguistic comprehension. Fundamentally, of course, decoding is being able to translate a printed word or text into the pronunciation, right? And then linguistic comprehension is understanding the information received orally, where reading comprehension, it's essentially the same as linguistic comprehension, but we're receiving the information through print as opposed to hearing. in building a scope and sequence, we really have to think about what we call constrained and unconstrained knowledge. So, for example, the ability to name lower and uppercase letters is an example of constrained knowledge, right? There are exactly a certain number of letters in the English alphabet, right? On the other hand, something like vocabulary skills are unconstrained because the number of words we can learn is maybe not entirely without bounds, but certainly so large as to effectively be so. So this dynamic between constrained and unconstrained knowledge spans through the three phases, right? The scope of the early phases is relatively constrained, but as we become more and more proficient, the skills become more and more constrained. So to make progress and to build an effective scope and sequence, we do constrain the content and the focus of the later stages by identifying certain skills based on frequency and logical groupings and things like that we'll talk about in a moment. So often referred to as the 5 pillars of effective literacy instruction, these 5 areas, or sometimes 6 when oral language comprehension is included, these create a foundation for teaching reading. And this is what we'll look at through the 3 phases, right? So each phase might have a focus, but we're still weaving in skills throughout. We're not ignoring comprehension in phase 1 to focus solely on decoding skills. We're still working on things like that. So when we look at these 5 components, I want you to take a moment and put in the chat which ones you think would tend to be more constrained and which are more unconstrained. I'll give you a moment there. Please feel free to put that in the chat. Nikki is out. Do we have the chat active now that I realize it? Let me just double check here. Yeah. Any thoughts on which elements are constrained versus unconstrained? Thanks, Erica. Thanks, Carlos. We had some hiccups in an earlier webinar where the chat wasn't enabled, so I realized we should probably double check that. Kind of given away the answer, I think, by talking about how we shift from more constrained to more unconstrained knowledge, right, through the phases. And similarly, as we go kind of left to right here on this continuum, we would shift from constrained to constrained. Okay. So in addition to those dynamics, we also need to think about the 3 other core principles, right? Prerequisite skills, efficiency, and motivation. So prerequisite skills are those that have to be mastered, right? So that students can learn subsequent skills and build on top of those, right? An efficient order, we have to ensure that they have time to practice, apply the skills. We don't overlook skills, but also that we unlock the most print possible at each stage, right? And enable students to decode or spell or read the maximum amount possible at any given moment to ensure that they feel motivated, right? We want to ensure that they have a motivation to be engaged with the learning process, especially something that's challenging and requires a great deal of effort, like learning to read. The good example of student engagement that we often give is with respect to the assessment component. Students are often so engaged and so excited to demonstrate their learning that they're coming to the teachers to ask to be assessed, to say, I want to show just how much I've learned. Can you reassess me at this point? We're going to take another little break here and do what we call a waterfall activity. So I'll get you to type your answers to these questions. We'll do two questions. Type them in, but don't submit the answer. So I'll give you all a moment to do so. And then we'll put them all in at the same time. So first of all, I want you to write as many words as you can using with a 2 to 3 letters using the following set of letters. So we have R, T, N, A, and E. So I want you to write in the chat. Don't hit send. As many words as you can possibly think of using those 5 letters. And you might want to avoid things like R-controlled vowels, right? Car, art, are. Those are a little bit more complex. Give it another 15 seconds or so. Okay, go ahead and hit enter. See how many words you've been able to write. So, thank you. Good numbers. Okay, so that's a first set of letters to use. But then if we add on top of that a certain set of additional words that you can use, how many sentences could you write? Let's try to get two, and the same thing, don't enter your actual sentence yet. Don't submit it. But using those words and any that you wrote or any that you see there in the chat from those 5 letters, can you write 2 sentences? And I'll give you about maybe 30 seconds. Okay, go ahead and hit enter. See what sentences you're able to come up with. 10 ants ran. Rat can love a girl. That's a good one. Thanks, Selena. Okay, so those are actually examples of the first set of phonemes, letter sounds, that we teach through Confident Learners. So in the first module on phonemes, we actually are focusing on A, R, T, N, and E. Additionally, we're also looking at that first set of high frequency words through Confident Learners. So high frequency word, if you're not familiar with it, right, is one that appears frequently in text, like children's books, school books, magazines, etc. What we do through Confident Learners is explicitly teach 10 high frequency words in each module or each component of the sequence, so that students are not only learning to decode using the phonemes, right, or the letters there, A, R, T, N, and E, but they're also able to make use of those high frequency words, right? You teach those phonemes, and then you add just 10 high frequency words that you can make more and more interesting sentences right off the bat. So just by way of example, the set of high frequency words here through the first 5 or so modules, they're broadly based off the Dolch and Frey list with additions to ensure that they encompass sort of a broader range of the elements of the English language. So you can see pronouns, nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, etc. And so those are paired with the phonemes in phase 1 in particular, but they span into phase 2 as well, for a total of 300 high frequency words. And then in phase 3, we're actually focusing more on comprehension and vocabulary building, and we start to bring in subject area or content area words, phase 3. Okay, I'll ask a very easy question. First one to put it in the chat will win a prize. Haven't yet determined what. How many letters are there in the English alphabet? 26, right? Now, how many phonemes are there associated with those 26 letters? Not so quick. Good answers. Okay, but right, there's a slight hesitation where we all know there are 26 letters in the English alphabet, but we're not quite as prepared or as quick to name the number of phonemes. So the primary objective in phase 1 is learning how to decode words, as we said, right? Before students can understand what they're reading, they need to be able to identify the words accurately, efficiently, and retain that information, right, in what we call working memory, right? So in Confident Learners, we explicitly teach the sounds of the 44 English phonemes. And there is some debate, 42, 44. We've certainly chosen to go the most exhaustive possible range of phonemes. So we teach those explicitly and the relationships to the letters that represent those sounds in text, right? So as students begin to learn those sounds, they can realize that there's a structure here. There's a predictable relationship, right, with what you see in print and what you see, or what you hear rather, in words, right? So that realization, the connection between print and sounds and patterns in spoken language is called the alphabetic principle. That's common throughout many languages, but not all. Sounds are associated with letters, right? Letters can be combined and decoded, and decoding those words helps match the sounds of a word with the overall pronunciation and at the end of the day, the meaning, right? So the meaning that we've stored or that we've learned. After a few exposures to the same word, oftentimes that word no longer needs to be decoded or sounded out, and it becomes, in effect, a sight word, right? We know that word by sight without consciously sounding it out, and we know there what it means. These decoding skills do need to be explicitly taught with a systematic approach, right? It really is the aim of phase one, but there are a certain number of prerequisite skills such as concepts about print and letter knowledge, phonemic awareness, phonological awareness that we need to ensure are in place. And then we begin to gradually introduce language skills through phases 2 and 3. When students are learning reading comprehension, they're also increasing their vocabulary, right? As we mentioned earlier. The scope of phase 1 is quite defined, right? It's very constrained knowledge. So we move from pre-reading skills to the 44 phonemes, right? And then the ability to decode with those 44 phonemes. The scope also includes the high frequency words that we referred to, but additionally spelling and writing simple words, for example, consonant, vowel, consonant words, CVC words that are decodable. And that explicit spelling, right, supports learning how to decode, focusing if we're focusing on that same set of phonemes that students are learning, right? Reinforces implicit pattern learning and motivation, right? If students can learn how to spell like the name, things like the names of their, family members, themselves, favorite animal, pet, superhero, those are nice wins from very early on. So all of those things kind of fit together in this sort of Duplo or Lego structure within phase 1, right? So in the bottom half, we have those prerequisite skills, that alphabetic principle, and then we work on decoding and word recognition. With respect to the sequence, right, we've really looked at those factors that we mentioned earlier, in particular efficiency, right? Maximizing the number of words that children can decode based on the phoneme grapheme relationships, PGRs. So again, the phoneme, sound, grapheme, the text, those relationships that they've learned. So we could teach those based on the frequency. You might begin then with RTNILS, for example, the single letters. But if we adhere just to that, or if we only do that based on frequency, it doesn't take into consideration groupings of things that are best taught and learned together, like short vowels, long vowels, R-controlled vowels, right? So our sequence considers the number of new words a student can decode as they learn each set, as well as those practical groupings of phoneme grapheme relationships. So the first set here, modules 4 through 9, that's 27 basic phoneme grapheme relationships, right? You can see they're primarily, in fact, entirely represented by a single grapheme, right? And that actually, those sounds are included in approximately 68% of English words. When we look at the advanced phoneme grapheme relationships, they're included an additional 11% of words, bringing the total to 79% just with those 44 phonemes. I'm going to switch gears here slightly away from scope and sequence and talk a little bit about assessment, right? So when we go back to confident learners, right, we have that assessment component that informs instruction. And we've defined the scope and sequence of becoming a reader, of confident learners And only then have we gone to build an assessment that's going to give us very exacting information about how each student is doing, what they need to learn next, and how they're progressing over time. We would assess students early on to establish a baseline, and after that, we would continuously assess based on the pace of learning. There's a particular structure to the assessment. We talk a lot more about that in the show and tell if you'd like to see that. But just by way of illustration, within the first assessment, para or phonics advantage reading assessment that is aligned to the phase 1 skills that we've just been discussing, we assess for each of those elements as we work our way through the scope and sequence, right? So we do the pre-reading skills, letter knowledge, then we begin to work on those phonemes in the same sequence as we saw there, the basic to advanced, as well as spelling and being able to read high frequency words. And what that looks like in terms of growth is, for an individual student, we might see them assessed 5 to 10 times. In this case, our friend Max was assessed 5 times in the first, looks like 180 days roughly of the school year. You can see he's progressed nicely from his initial assessment and is now working on, looks like reading that first passage with accuracy in phase 1, perhaps. When we think back to that age range or skill range, rather, challenge, right, that everyone faces, I think this report at the classroom level really lays that bare. And this is a real example, certainly with anonymized students, but it's pretty typical of what we see across our classrooms using confident learners. There is a wide range of skills. So one thing that this report allows us to do, though, is sort and organize the information so that we can start to see groupings of students where they might be working on similar or related skills, right? And so we can see that in particular here. There's a large number of students who are working on decoding and the first or second set of basic phonemes here, right? So on challenges 4 through 7, we're working on the first set of 10 and then an additional set of 13 basic phonemes and decoding with those phonemes. So this classroom report becomes one of the primary focuses for not just the classroom teacher, but our instructional support staff and the school team to support each and every learner. And at the highest level, or the school level and above, we have our hot air balloon chart showing progress at an aggregate level. So we would start to see this baseline established early in the year and the numbers decreasing here as students move on and up through the skills in phase 1 and through phase 1, 2, and 3. So there'd be a similar chart for phases 2 and 3. Erica, I'm going to turn it over to you just to walk us through some strategies and activities for phase 1 instruction, the more practical aspect of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Simon. So yeah, once we have all of that data and we know what the scope and sequence is, we really want to think about, what does it look like in the classroom or in the school? So most timetables in elementary schools have 1 or more literacy blocks ranging from probably 45 to 90 minutes in length. And what we usually do is we call for 2 50-minute literacy blocks, but we know that's not always possible in all schools and all days because we all have various specialists happening as well. But we really want to design these literacy blocks to embed daily routines and really enable our students to learn quickly those foundational reading skills that Simon was talking about. So each one of our literacy blocks includes strategies that are commonly used in the elementary classroom: read alouds, guided reading, writing, shared reading, our phonics lessons, songs and movements, and all of this helps to connect with those strategies in an intentional, meaningful way with the scope and sequence skills that Simon talked about. So I'm going to highlight just a couple of things that were found in phase 1, just to give you a little bit of a taste. So one of the things I talked about a second ago was guided reading. And when we're looking at guided reading, I want you to imagine that I have a guided reading group of students who are working on segmenting sentences into words. So we have a sentence, how many words do you hear in that sentence? Or breaking words into syllables, or maybe they're doing a little bit of both. And maybe they're even isolating that initial sound using some of those first phonemes that we've worked on. So I would probably select some books that have been taught, are at the beginning of the week. It might be ones that I had used as a read aloud, so there is some familiarity and comprehension in it as well, and I can revisit. But what I want to plan and use my resources for is to be really intentional with my guided reading instruction with that particular group. So I want to think about, my focus for a read aloud might have been one thing with the whole class, but maybe in this guided section, I really want to pinpoint what it is those students are working on according to their data. So I'd always have some instructional resources ready at hand, something to support the lesson, maybe a whiteboard or a chalkboard, a stick to point to words, highlighting markers, Post-it notes, magnetic letters, anything that I could use that would help reinforce the skills that I'm going to teach. And then once I've identified those skills, which at the beginning I said would be sentence segmentation and syllable segmentation, along with some isolation of initial phonemes, I would demonstrate how to use the skills. So maybe I'd select a page out of the book or a few sentences out of the book, and we would segment those sentences into words. So in the story, we read this sentence. How many words do we hear in that story? Let's stomp them or let's clap them. Maybe I would select a couple of words to segment into syllables. So brother, let's clap how many syllables are in brother. And then maybe I might identify some words that begin with a certain sound, maybe one of the sounds that we've been working on. Let's say the word met. What's the sound that we hear at the beginning of the word met? Can you make that letter on your whiteboard? So really bringing everything together and being really intentional about it. And then after we've had that guided reading lesson, maybe we would co-write or write a message of 1 or 2 sentences using some of those decodable words that we talked about building with the phonemes that we've been working on, using some of our high frequency words, just as you guys did in our waterfall activity. And that message can be about the story. It can be about a pet. It can be about an event going on in the school. And, those sentences can be brought back, during your guided reading next day or during a structured lesson to review and practice those decoding skills. And they can also be used to teach those encoding skills, so that writing process. I'll get you to switch the slide for me, Simon. Thank you. So I wanted to highlight one of the activities. So this activity would go with that guided reading lesson that I just suggested. And it is in phase 1 of systematic reading instruction. And what this activity is, it's an I Spy game. And it starts off with using the syllables. So I spy with my little eye, something that has... I spy with my little eye a table. Let's clap the word table into syllables. Table. So you could start it off that way, but you could easily adapt that activity. I spy with my little eye someone in this class who has 3 syllables in their name, right? So Gabrielle. I spy with my little eye something that starts with the first sound B. And so, while the lessons are there and they're to a specific skill, they are easily differentiatable in order to work with other skills as well. All right. I think it's back to you, Simon.
Thanks, Erica. A lot of ground to cover. We've talked a lot about some of the bigger structures and phase 1. So now we can talk about phases 2 and 3 without having to delve too much further into that background information. So in phase 1, right, students are learning the sounds associated with those letters and that they can be combined to decode words. In phase 2, what we want is for students to be able to recognize more and more words by sight, right? That is to say, read them quickly without having to decode or sound them out. So they're identifying the words and accessing the meaning of the word, and that's orthographic learning, orthographic mapping. So when they encounter a word, maybe for the first time, the very first time, they can use the decoding skills they've obtained in order to read it. And each time they then encounter it again, the processing time or the need to decode it lessens until the word is familiar, it's recognized by sight. So after students have learned how to decode words with the phoneme-grapheme relationships in phase 1, they can actually read about 80% of all single syllable words. So in phase 2, they're continuing to build on this with an additional set of phoneme-grapheme relationships and learn the structure of words such as prefixes and suffixes and etymology. So a key milestone in phase 2 is when students really begin to read independently, right? So the emphasis on decoding single words is shifting towards shorter passages and stories. They're really making that transition from, becoming a reader to becoming a skilled reader. And when students are reading independently, they're self-teaching, right? They're making that transition from decoding to orthographic learning. So we're extending the set of basic and advanced phoneme grapheme relationships associated with the 44 phonemes, right, in phase 1. And in doing so, we're increasing the number of words that students can decode, right? And they can come closer and closer to the correct pronunciation of words they can partially decode. So in phase 2, we're extending the number of high frequency words from 120 to 300. This is the total sum of the high frequency words in confident learners, right? And when those words alongside all of the phoneme grapheme relationships are put together, students have access to about 90% of the words they'll encounter when reading. We talked about the 26 letters, the 44 phonemes. There's actually more phoneme grapheme relationships or letter combinations that represent those sounds. Does anyone know how many there are? Put that in the chat if you have a guess. How many print representations are there of the 44 sounds in English language? $150. Any other guesses? Okay. Well, again, it's an example of how we're not used to speaking about learning to read or the English language in this manner, right? So yeah, the potential scope for phase 2 is actually unconstrained when we think about there are 250 phoneme grapheme relationships or letter combinations that represent the sounds. There's also 250 or more prefixes and suffixes. It's not practical or engaging, interesting for students to be explicitly taught those 250 phoneme grapheme relationships and 250 prefixes and suffixes. So we constrain the scope of phase 2 skills accordingly, right? So we look at the 34 most common phoneme grapheme relationships that are on top of those basic and advanced ones learned in phase 1, right? And then we also look at the 24 most common prefixes and suffixes, right? In phase 1, the students are beginning to learn how to spell words, but the focus is really primarily on decoding. Spelling does take on a bit more of a prominent role in phase 2, where we focus on building a cache or a grouping of words that students can spell and explicitly teaching also a certain number of basic spelling rules. So that's the overall scope of phase 2. And this graph is really good to show that idea of efficiency and the access to the English language, right? So as students learn those phonemes in phase 1, the number of words they can sound out is, increasing dramatically, right? So we look at that first set of basic phonemes. The 23 basic phonemes are included in about 66% of English words. And then as we work through the advanced phonemes in phase 1, those are included, as we said before, right? 11% of English words, bringing the total to about 77%. Now, when we add in these 34 phoneme grapheme relationships in phase 2, those are included in a further 14% of English words, bringing the total to 91%. So at the end of phase 2, students will know 78 different phoneme grapheme relationships. A full set would mean another 172 if we wanted to get to 250, but those remaining phoneme grapheme relationships are a lot less common and they only count for that remaining 9% of English words. But we're not explicitly teaching those through the scope and sequence. They're not less important, they're just less frequent. So the sequence for teaching these phoneme grapheme relationships is based on the frequency, right? And those practical considerations for their teaching, right? So for example, words with long vowels that link to a silent E, bake, tire, or cure, or other examples here on screen, they're the most common ones with some exceptions. So we want to teach those phoneme grapheme relationships with a silent E grapheme as a set, right? The A underscore E, these, nice, home. And the sequence is set out by module, much like phase one. There is review of the phonemes that were covered in phase one, those in those couple in yellow there. And as I said, it's primarily based on their frequency, but they're grouped to make it easier for students to learn key concepts like that long E rule and help them practice decoding words. Instruction in morphology and etymology are really a way to accelerate growth and access to print. Students will tend to become more skilled readers if they receive explicit instruction in these areas, the forms of words, their origins and historical development, and how they relate to other things they already know. I know, speaking personally, how often knowing the understanding a word has a Greek or a Latin root or German root has aided my comprehension and expression, right? My writing. So as students are learning those 34 phoneme grapheme relationships, they're also receiving direct instruction on 24 affixes, prefixes, and suffixes, including their meaning and origin. And that is also based on the frequency of those affixes. Much like with phase one, the assessment for phase two is going to follow the same sequencing, where we're looking at those additional phoneme grapheme relationships, high frequency words, spelling and reading, shorter passages, but then, short sentences and texts, and then passages, right? Accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. So while again, phases 1 and 2 are generally weighted more towards coding skills, we are still ensuring that we are covering things like reading comprehension with accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. So Eric, I'll hand it back over to you to talk a little bit about strategies and activities for phase 2.
Works way better when I unmute my mic. We already talked a little bit about the wide range of students that we have in our classrooms. We may have a classroom where some students are ready for phase 2, some students may be in the early stages of phase 1, some students may not have yet mastered some of those pre-literacy skills that we were talking about. And so there's always that kind of learning divide, or the split between the students who can decode simple CVC words and those who might be ready to read short passages with accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. And so one question that we often ask ourselves is, how can we help teachers to manage this wide range of reading skills? And while there's no one-size-fits-all answer, we do know that to be able to do so requires that intentional and effective instructional planning. And one of the strategies that we use that I kind of referred to in the last lesson that we talked about is being able to use some class-wide activities that can be adapted to various places where the students are in terms of their modules and lessons. So you may have one activity working on high frequency words, but we have available in the materials for students who are early in the phase 1, mid phase 1, beginning phase 2, right through, so that you're able to adapt and meet their needs, but also help yourself with that intentional planning, because you're not planning for 8 different groups at one time. Another strategy that we use for managing that wide range of reading skills in the classroom is incorporating instruction for different levels into our weekly planning or our weekly lesson plans. So if you have students in phase 1 and 2, you might create a weekly lesson plan that accommodates that scope of skills and helps you to be more intentional in your planning and able to ensure that you're meeting the needs of the students in front of you. So for phase 2, I'm going to pick on the area of spelling, so effective strategies for teaching spelling. So when we consider, when we think about our spelling, we think about 2 strategies for teaching. One is to build that bank or that cache of words that a student can spell without directly applying spelling rules. So they're applying those skills that we talked about with the phonemes and graphemes. They're becoming very familiar with those words. They become automatic. We also emphasize the spelling of irregular and high frequency words. And we have that another rule, or sorry, the second way is through teaching those spelling rules. So really looking at how do the spelling rules work in the English language? Again, which ones are used most, which ones are most supportive of the children. So thinking about, exploring open and closed syllables, affixes. So if I can add the affix re in front of a word, it means to do it again, right? Changing nouns from singular to plural and vice versa, adding verb endings and using suffixes. So really thinking about how students are able to improve their spelling by letting them practice that and really think about the rules. So as you go into phase 2, get you to switch the slide. There we go. We have a variety of activities that can help with that. So phase 2 is laid out very similarly to phase 1. You can find the strategies to support that effective instruction and plan your lessons. And one activity that's used for spelling that I pulled out here is the more than one. So that is an activity where students learn and practice the spelling rules for changing nouns into their plural form. And it not just works with the rules that are regular, but also helps them to practice irregular verbs, nouns as well. It's getting too late in the day for my parts of speech. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Erica. So let's talk a little bit about phase 3, and then we can wrap up with some questions. I'm sure you have many. We may or may not get to them today, but in phase 3, really we're focusing on reading comprehension, right? Understanding the meaning of a written text, and that direct link from written text to understanding is shown in with that large green arrow. If we look back through phases 1 and 2, we were decoding, we were building that bank of that mental dictionary, and reading comprehension is really achieved by those 3 things, right? Interacting with text using cognitive resources, short-term memory, executive functioning skills such as planning, organizing, setting goals, using background knowledge, right? A really important factor to understand the text, and then applying processes to understand it, right? Linking words to text and making sense of shorter stretches. This is the overarching framework within phase 3. We'll talk a little bit about one of them in particular. There's a lot more information, again, in the systematic reading instruction course. So these core elements, right? Reading processes, writing conventions, writing processes, and vocabulary and spelling skills also support, of course, reading and writing. In phase 3, we really are dealing with unconstrained skills. Becoming an expert reader is a lifetime endeavor, right? I've encountered new words regularly, even well beyond my secondary school career. So we want to still delimit a scope and sequence, though, right? By thinking about practical considerations. It is more challenging than the first 2 phases, of course, right? But these are the strands we've divided things into, and these strands overlap, right? Need to be taught together with instruction and activities in a variety of different places throughout the school year. So let's take a quick look at the writing process, right? These are the steps that you would take to a piece of writing, right? So we've laid that out in 7 steps. It's not linear, right? It's a bit of a back and forth process, right? As I'm sure we all know, that's what leads to a great piece of text, right? So after you share a draft with colleagues or teacher, you might return to the planning stage and reevaluate, right? Now, when you've reached that later stage, the evaluation stage, for example, you still might return to the draft stage and continue to revise and improve until you're satisfied, right? Publishing or wrapping it up and then celebrating. So that's just one very brief example, and again, a lot more information in the course. As with phases 1 and 2, right, there is an assessment aligned to the skills of phase 3. It's a little more difficult to structure as rigidly because of the unconstrained nature of the skills, but we're really focusing on reading passages with accuracy and then being able to define words used in the text, as well as 3 key elements that are derived from pearls in particular, which I think I'll speak about in a moment here. So identifying explicitly stated information, interpreting it, and making inferences about the text. Those are 3 critical skills with respect to comprehension. So just before I hand it over to Erica, right? So as I mentioned, that framework is used by the International Association for Evaluation of Educational Achievement in the PEARLS, or Progress for International Reading Literacy Study. We also include these 10 strategies for reading comprehension. So these are based on the evidence from a variety of different studies about students' ability to understand narrative and informational texts. Of course, the National Reading Panel has already identified a number of these strategies, and since then, a number of other studies have shown their effectiveness since 2000. So I'll pass that over to you, Erica, to talk a little bit more about strategies and activities for phase 3.
Thank you. So phase 3 really focuses on these 10 strategies for reading comprehension. Many of them you guys will already be familiar with and are probably using them in things like your read alouds with your students. So, while there might be one or two that might be a little bit less certain for you, they're all things that you guys already do all the time when you're reading with students. And it really is the focus of phase 3 to help students to be able to do that themselves independently. So I'm going to get Simon to change the slide. And I'm going to quickly just focus on one of those activities that we have that helps to do that. So an activity we have is called Read, Stop, Write, Draw. I always get those in the wrong order, so I had to read those off the screen. And the purpose of this activity is to provide students with that opportunity to practice comprehension monitoring and to get into that habit of stopping as they're reading and thinking about what they read. So I've done this activity with a classroom with wide range of students, and we've done it as a read aloud, and we've also had students do it who are able to read independently themselves, right? So already we were able to differentiate because students who weren't quite reading themselves, we had them go through the activity in order to support building that. So we would read, we would stop at a certain point, we would have the students write down or draw what they remembered from the story or what they felt were the key pieces to remember from the story. Then we would start reading again. And then at the end, we had the students pair up and talk about what they remembered from the story, what they felt were the most important pieces to remember. And so we were able to do that with a wide range of students just by adjusting the expectation of what the students were going to do in that activity. And then as the teacher revisited that activity after we had left, the teacher was able to see the progress in the students who had started with just the drawing or may have started with only writing a couple of words or a sentence. And so that's the other piece about our activities is they don't need to be just done once. We can come back and revisit them so that we have that ability to collect that evidence of growth as our students are completing the work. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Erica. So we've covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time here, but just as a reminder, right, the 3 phases span coding skills through to reading comprehension in three very structured, very intentional sections that are paired with assessment and professional learning. That professional learning is the systematic reading instruction course. So it'll bring all of these elements together, pairing the science of reading, right, the theory with the science of teaching or the instructional practices, the best practices, with the elements of the 3 phases. You have 100 activities with the systematic reading instruction course, an additional over 280, I think, with confident learners, and those high frequency words and subject area words. So again, the literacy suite that we offer covers a range of options. We've talked about systematic reading instruction as the underpinning and the professional learning, and about confident learners as the intervention for students. We also offer the early years evaluation pre-reading assessment for those clients using early years evaluation, which is focused primarily on kindergarten. Well, thank you very much. I will turn it over to Gabby to wrap us up and open the floor to questions.
Thanks, Simon. I've been keeping an eye on the chat here, I should say, sorry, and I haven't seen any questions come in, but I would like to reiterate that if anyone does have any final thoughts or questions for Simon or Erica, now would be a great time to pop them into the chat as we have them both here. We have their time here, so we can definitely poke their very smart brains on any questions that you may have. Okay, hopefully I haven't missed anything. I haven't seen anything come through. I'm sure if you do have any questions afterwards or after you sit on this information, you can certainly reach out to any of us at the Learning Bar team, and we'll be sure to get back to you. Simon, did you want to add anything else there?
Just to make note of the upcoming webinar. So this was one in a series. The next one will be post-Christmas in late January, led by our founder, Dr. Willems, navigating the barriers. So addressing the three wicked problems, two of which we kind of alluded to earlier on, right? The decline in reading scores and the age range we see in classrooms. So don't miss that. And I'm sure stay tuned for additional sessions delivered by our team here at the Learning Bar.
Thank you everyone for joining today. Thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. If you have some snow, make sure you're dressed up warmly and you're prepared for the weather. It is December. So have a great rest of your day and a wonderful weekend.